Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, with the very recent passing of Pope Francis, I thought it was most appropriate that we dive into some history of the papacy. And this will be hardly the last time we'll touch on this topic, but I'm actually getting ready to head to Central Europe. I'm going to be in Germany, Slovakia, Czechia, and Austria for the next 9 days. And I'm trying to record a bunch of videos ahead of time to get some content out there. So we'll definitely cover the topic some more, especially things like how the Pope is selected and those sorts of things. But I thought this was an interesting one as far as diving in a little bit to the history of the papacy and how the Pope came to be for a long time in our world history, more than just a religious leader, but very much a political and powerful leader in that sense as well. So the channel History Mapped Out, which we've taken a look at before and does great content, has a video called The Origins of Papacy and the Road to Power. History Mapped Out's at 84,000 subscribers. One of the magic numbers you can get to is 100,000. That's when you get this fun thing here behind me, the silver play button you get for 100,000 subscribers, which I've been very lucky to have mine for almost 4 years now. And I know how exciting it would be for him to get there. So if you like what you see, definitely click on the link down in the description and head over to his channel and subscribe. Let's get him a little bit closer to that number. All right, let's dive into this one.
The authority of the Pope is shrouded in a multitude of stories, legends, and rumors, ranging from unfounded grievances to serious accusations of crimes. Interestingly, the principles of the Pope's divine authority are rooted in the semi-legendary accounts of the Apostle Peter. In 42 AD, after escaping from prison in Jerusalem, the Apostle Peter disappears from the pages of history. According to the most popular version, he went to Rome, where he led the local Christian community, but was executed during the persecution of Christians by Emperor Nero.
Yeah, so the actual kind of origin of Peter as being considered to be the first pope actually goes back to a conversation recorded in the Gospels. And this is where Protestants and Catholics differ on interpretation of the same conversation. There's a conversation where Jesus is sitting around with some of his disciples, and he asks them the question, "Who do people say that I am?" And they start saying, well, some people say you're Elijah, and some people say you're John the Baptist. And they're throwing out all these ideas about who people think Jesus is. And then he makes it personal. He says, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter, who never had any trouble speaking up, he's one of those guys who speaks first and thinks about what he said later. He says, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus responds, because at this point, Peter's name is actually Simon. Peter is a nickname that he's given. It means the rock. It's a Cephas in the language that they spoke, or Cephas, C-E-P-H-A-S. And it means rock. And he says, "And I say that you are Peter, you are the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Now, the Catholic interpretation of that then is that the rock, the church, is being built on the rock that is on Peter. And so Peter is the first head of the church, and he is the vicar of Christ, basically God's representative of Christ on earth after Christ is gone. And so Peter is the first then in a long succession of popes. Whereas those in my interpretation of that as a Protestant, and in particular as somebody who comes from a non-denominational Christian church, we look at that same thing and we focus on the statement where Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And to us, that is the rock on which the church was built, that confession of faith. And so whenever I baptize somebody, I ask them to repeat that confession of faith. I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so it's just a difference of interpretation, but that's where that's where the basis of Peter as the first pope. And yes, early 60s AD, the persecution under Nero, which is rather localized. It wasn't an empire-wide thing, and it was limited in its scope, but it takes Peter, it takes Paul, it takes others.
It is from the Apostle Peter that the tradition of the Roman bishops began, who later gained absolute ecclesiastical power, their own state and wealth, and entered history under the title of Pope. Early Christians lived in scattered communities.
Yeah.
Each community was led by a bishop. His title comes from the Greek word meaning overseer.
And sometimes that is also interpreted as elder, like appoint elders and appoint bishops to overseers. So they were basically what we would really consider today like the pastor of a local church. Because at the time you just had local churches. And so the church in Laodicea had a bishop, and the church in Pergamum had a bishop, and the church in Jerusalem had a bishop.
In addition to religious activities, he was responsible for overseeing life within the community, resolving disputes, and representing the community to other Christians. He was assisted in this by presbyters and deacons. By the end of the 3rd century, 5 bishops emerged as the most authoritative: the bishops of Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem.
Basically, these are large centers of population that also have strong Christian populations, and so it just became natural by the fact that there are just a lot of Christians in those places.
Due to the scattered nature of Christian communities across the empire, different regions interpreted the shared religion in various ways. The desire to establish one's own version of Christianity as the singular true interpretation led to numerous conflicts between communities.
Yeah, and there's a lot of reasons for this. You have differing cultures and differing values of things. And Paul, when he's writing in his letters, he talks about how, to the Greek I became a Greek so that I could win the Greeks, and to the Jew I became a Jew. And he's not necessarily meaning that you just pretend to be something you're not, but what he's saying is I found a way of taking our faith and making it understandable to that culture. Today, for example, if we talk about the idea of having Jesus in your heart, that makes sense to an English-speaking culture because the idea of having someone in your heart is considered to be the center of your essence. Well, that's not true in every culture. In some cultures, you might want to have Jesus in your stomach because your stomach is where it's considered to be. And so that's just a different way of saying the same thing, but in a way that makes sense in that culture. And so that's why you start to see differences of opinion on how worship should be done. You have debates between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, non-Jews, over things like circumcision, and there's a lot of that going on in the book of Acts,
which began to label their opponents as heretics. The active centralization of Christianity took place during the reign of the Roman Emperor Constantine. According to legend, in 315, he contracted leprosy and sought treatment from Christians. They advised him to be baptized, and a miracle occurred. His leprosy was cured. The emperor then established a new capital, Constantinople, and in gratitude to the Pope, transferred the administration of the entire western half of the empire to him. Although the decree, known as the Donation of Constantine, turned out to be a forgery that was only uncovered in the 15th century, it did not prevent the Roman bishop from strengthening his power.
Yeah, just because it may not have been true doesn't mean that they didn't operate like it was true. But so already what you're seeing here is you're starting to see the mixing of the secular authority and the religious authority, and the granting of secular power to a spiritual leader in the Pope, in the Bishop of Rome. And it's those mixings of that line between secular and spiritual that's going to start to give the Pope a lot of temporal power here on earth.
All the same, this is merely a legend, and the Pope did not hold significant secular power or possess a state of his own until the end of the 8th century. The biggest problem for early Christianity was the heresy known as Arianism. The presbyter Arius of Alexandria was primarily concerned with the role of Jesus Christ, though the movement quickly evolved into a political one, where, using Arius's works, lower clergy began to criticize the church leadership. In response, the church leadership criticized Arius and his followers for violating ecclesiastical norms.
And so you're going to constantly have these debates over things like the divinity of Jesus and the truth of certain scriptures, which ones are canon, which ones are really part of our scripture, and which ones are outside of the canon, outside of scripture. Who is the ultimate authority here on earth, or do we have multiple ultimate authorities? What is the nature of communion? Is it really the body and blood of Jesus? That's going to be one that's going to come later. All of these things help sift out where the power lies within the church.
The church found itself on the brink of a schism. To resolve the issue, Emperor Constantine convened the First Ecumenical Council.
And again, there you have secular authority giving its backing to the church and endorsing the church having this Council of Nicaea.
Also known as the First Council of Nicaea. Bishops from various corners of the empire condemned Arius and his followers, but they were unable to banish their teachings as they were too popular, and a significant portion of Christians already adhered to them. It took nearly a century for the Christian church to suppress Arianism.
So, and they're going to come up with the Nicene Creed, among other things, which is going to try to standardize the basic tenets of what Christians believe. And, just like you have the Apostles' Creed, which is very similar to it. I believe in God the Father, Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only begotten Son, our Lord. He was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He ascended into hell, and on the third day rose again. All of these things became things that people would repeat because it was a way of getting them to be on the same page as Christians.
Even as it waned in the Roman Empire, Arian priests successfully preached among the Germanic tribes living on the borders. Still, this conflict contributed to the centralization of the church. Bishops gained more power. It was during this time that the 5 bishops leading the major cities were granted the title Pope, which means father in Greek. At the end of the 4th century, Europe experienced the Great Migration of nations, dozens of Germanic tribes.
And it's very interesting to me how some of these traditions develop. And we had seen the same thing with the Jewish religion for a while there. And it's what Jesus is kind of confronting when during his time. If you read through the Gospels, you read through Matthew, for example, he's confronting the religious leaders in Rome, or not in Rome, in Jerusalem. And a lot of what he's confronting them about is their man-made rules and regulations that they have built around God's rules and regulations. And so now the Christian church is starting to do the same thing. It's starting to create these man-made titles like Father, which is interesting because Jesus, at one point, he says, you only have one Father, and that's your Father in heaven. Don't call anyone Father. And yet they do that because we're humans, and as humans, we start to put ourselves into it as much as we can. That's why today in the modern church, you have so many different kinds of churches who believe so many different things, because at some point, some humans decided they didn't like how things were being done, so they did it a different way. And they got away from the essence of what the church originally was.
Many of which were Arians, migrated into the lands of the Roman Empire. There, they established their own states, known as the barbarian kingdoms. While secular authority displayed its ineptitude, the authority of the church began to rise. Church leaders skillfully manipulated political circumstances to their advantage. When Attila the Hun invaded Italy in 451, Pope Leo I the Great negotiated with him and secured an agreement for the Huns to withdraw.
And by this point, Rome is in steep decline, and in the centuries to come, Rome is going to go from a city that had 1 million people at the height of the Roman Empire to only having maybe 10, 20,000 people. It's going to be this just wreckage of a city. And the center of power has moved away, and even the capital of the Western Roman Empire goes up to Ravenna.
This was immediately proclaimed as a divine deliverance and an achievement of the Pope. When the Vandals sacked Rome 3 years later, it was depicted as a punishment for the sins of the Romans. Christians were then urged to heed the guidance of church leaders more attentively. When the Western...
there's a vacuum of power in Rome because the center of the Roman government isn't there anymore. You don't have an emperor there anymore. So now the Pope has more and more secular authority, which religious authority already existed.
Roman Empire fell in 476. The Ostrogoths did not harm the Pope. Soon after, the Roman bishops began to extend their influence beyond Italy. In 498, King Clovis of the Franks was baptized. Over the next century, the Burgundians, Alemanni, and Visigoths converted from Arianism to the Latin Rite.
And so you can see why the Pope in Rome, because he's the Bishop of Rome, why he, rather than these other popes, is going to have so much power and authority. Why? Because he's the only one of these 5 great bishops that's anywhere close to all of these new places where the church is expanding rapidly.
The Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons also began. Around the 7th century, papal envoys encountered the Celtic Church on the British Isles, which had developed among the Gaelic and Brittonic tribes. This church spread without the involvement of missionaries from Rome, and thus remained independent of the Pope. Conflicts were further fueled.
St. Patrick, who was Romano-Briton from this area here, hadn't come from Rome.
By certain semi-pagan traditions, norms, and calendar differences. Ultimately, in 664, at the Synod of Whitby, representatives from Rome triumphed, and the Latin Rite absorbed the Celtic Church. The Lombards remained Arians in Europe longer than any other group, having occupied Italy after the Ostrogoths. It was only towards the end of the 7th century that the Latin Rite of Christianity began to spread among them. Despite this, the Lombards continually clashed with the popes.
Yeah, because if you think about it, he keeps talking about Latin Rite, because obviously this is a way that the church in Rome has influence over these people, because they're all having their worship services in the language of Rome, in Latin, even though they have native tongues of their own. So it's making them more Roman in that sense, and that's why you call it the Roman Catholic Church. And Catholic just means universal. It's the universal Roman Church. But there's a lot of ways this could just still go differently, but everything kind of goes just right. And now eventually you're going to have the rise of the Frankish kingdom, and you're going to have Charlemagne, and you're going to have him and the Pope kind of solidifying each other's power.
The peak of the confrontation came in 753, when the Lombards captured Ravenna and began threatening Rome with their army. In response, Pope Stephen II traveled to the Franks and sought help from Pepin the Short. In return, he promised to recognize Pepin as the legitimate king. The Franks easily defeated the Lombards.
So you have this unification of the church and the state. I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. If you help me, then I'll give religious legitimacy to your claim. And this is where you start to get that idea that the church, and because the church has endorsed my reign, that means God has endorsed my reign. This is divine right of kings. It comes right from the church. The church has granted me this power that was given to them by God. Therefore, God has endorsed my throne.
And from the lands around Rome and Ravenna, they created a separate state and placed it under the authority of the Roman bishops. This event is known as the donation of Pepin, and, unlike the falsified donation of Constantine, it was this donation that granted the Pope real secular power. Over the next century, another significant process took place, the Carolingian Renaissance. Thanks to financial support from the Frankish emperors, European culture began to flourish. Even after the empire's fragmentation...
you're going to have, at this time, you have St. Peter's in Rome, which is built right on the site where Peter's tomb is, and we know that it's there to this day, and it's a fascinating story in and of itself to look at the history of how it went from being the Circus of Nero to being the original church that was built by Constantine. And you've got this St. Peter's that exists into the middle of the 2nd millennium AD, and it's only replaced by the current church then at that time. But you can go there, and you can actually go to this big red dot in the center, on the floor near the front of St. Peter's. And I have a picture of myself kneeling on the exact spot where Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope as Holy Roman Emperor.
The support from the Carolingians did not wane. It was during this period that the medieval church as we envision it today began to take shape. The Pope became not only the most influential bishop in Western Europe, but also the ruler of his own state. On one hand, this granted significant power, as land holdings were a primary indicator of status at the time.
Yeah, so you can just see how the papacy kind of evolved organically into what it became. It wasn't automatically like boom, one day at the very beginning, the Pope in Rome had all the authority over the entire church. It developed through a series of these events.
On the other hand, it created a problem. The position of the Pope was elective. With the establishment of his own state, not only clergy but also secular authorities became interested in the papacy, attempting to advance their own candidates in the elections. The situation...
Yeah, when you have that much power and authority, inevitably there's the fear of corruption. Money and power become corrupting influences, and you're going to see that a lot. You're going to see a lot of these popes. Religion's going to be kind of secondary to the secular authority that they could possibly have in power and influence.
The situation was further complicated by the fact that, at that time, the Pope was elected not by church representatives, but by the nobility and the common people of Rome. Pope Stephen V was a candidate of the Duke of Spoleto. In return for this support, he declared Guido of Spoleto as Emperor of the Romans and provided backing in all matters. Cardinal Formosus opposed this policy, attempting several times to become pope, but he was excommunicated and expelled from Rome.
And this is why it's such a bad thing that you have the church and the state mixing in this way, because both get corrupted.
Eventually, Formosus assumed the papal throne in 891, and rumors spread throughout Italy that he had poisoned his predecessor to achieve this. It is not surprising that Formosus soon found himself in conflict with Guido III. Lacking military forces of his own, the Pope sought an ally in Arnulf, king of the East Franks. Arnulf crossed the Alps in 893 and defeated Guido's army several times, forcing him to retreat to his ancestral castle. After 3 years of warfare, Formosus declared Arnulf the Emperor of the Romans. Yet, Arnulf faced setbacks. He fell ill and left Italy. His army was defeated by the Italians, and soon after, in 897, Pope Formosus died. Still, his story does not end there. The Cadaver Synod, as it was called by contemporaries, became one of the most horrific episodes in Rome's history. The new pope, Stephen VI, conducted a trial of the exhumed body of Formosus, interrogating it and accusing it of religious apostasy.
This is when you see power corrupting the church in horrific ways when it gets to this point.
The corpse endured numerous indignities and several attempts at burial, including being thrown into the Tiber River. 6 months later, a severe earthquake struck Rome. The Romans blamed Stephen VI for the calamity due to his desecration of the former pope's remains. This led to an anti-papal uprising in the city, during which Stephen VI was killed, sparking not only a struggle for papal power, but also for the Italian crown. Over the following decade, popes changed nearly every year. Attempts by secular authorities to interfere in the church did not cease. During this period, the family of Counts of Tusculum emerged on the political scene. In 904, Count Theophylact of Tusculum, with the help of the Duke of Spoleto's troops, seized Rome, killed the locally unrecognized Pope Christopher, and placed his cousin, Sergius III,
What'd you do that to
on
Christopher
the papal
for?
throne. Sergius III was a long-time political adversary of Formosus, and therefore conducted another cadaver synod against the former pope. Sergius III also repaid his patron Theophylact. He made Theophylact the consul of Rome, granting him full control over the city, and the church treasury became the personal account of Theophylact's
This is all
clan.
just horrible.
After the death of Sergius III, Anastasius III became pope. Rumors suggested that he was an illegitimate son of Theophylact's daughter, Marozia, and the former pope Sergius III.
And there were a lot of popes during all of this period that did have illegitimate children and did have mistresses and things like that. I mean, they basically ignored all the vows they were supposed to have been taking.
These rumors were not unfounded, as for the next 50 years, real power in Rome belonged to the Tusculum family, particularly Marozia, who even became Queen of Italy. She installed 2 of her lovers, Leo VI and Stephen VII, as popes, and also her own illegitimate son, John XI, who was reputedly fathered by Sergius III.
Crazy.
Marozia served as the prototype for the black legend of Papesse Jaune. Initially, the legend claimed that in the 10th century, Rome was so chaotic that a woman, through intrigue, became pope. Over time,
Unlikely.
the legend accumulated details about her scandalous reign, including tales that Papesse Jeanne gave birth during a church procession. While such events never occurred, these legends reflect the attitudes of the time towards the authority of the pope.
Yeah.
A notorious representative of the Tusculum family was Marozia's grandson, Octavian of Spoleto, who became Pope John XII in 955 at the age of just 18. He was involved in everything except ecclesiastical matters.
Yeah, you're 18 years old and they make you the pope. There's nothing religious authority related. There's nothing about spiritual leadership. There's nothing here about being called to this position. This is purely a political move.
In 963, he was condemned at a synod for selling bishoprics, losing church funds in gambling, praying to ancient Roman gods, turning the Lateran Basilica into a brothel, and committing many other crimes, including...
Now listen, I hope that as we're watching all of this, just as would be the case in any topic, just as we wouldn't, for example, look at a president like Woodrow Wilson and say, just because Woodrow Wilson was a horrible human being and did some terrible, damaging things as president, that every president who came after him was somehow also bad. It's important to note that just because they were corrupt people in this position doesn't mean that every person who has held this position is equally corrupt, because there were some really incredible popes throughout history, and we've had some good ones recently as well.
Including the rape of nuns. Pope John XII was absent from the synod. Shortly before, he had become involved in the war between King Berengar II of Italy and King Otto I of Germany. Initially, the Pope was an ally of Otto and even crowned him emperor, but he soon fell out with him, lost a battle to him at the walls of Rome, and fled the city. A year later, John regained control of Rome and even carried out reprisals against his judges. Nonetheless, Pope John XII soon died. He was killed by the husband of his mistress when the man caught them together in his bed.
Defenestration?
The
Thrown out a
period
window?
of the pornocracy in Rome ended with Pope John XII. Even so, the papacy did not regain its authority. Popes became dependent on the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, who now had the right to approve their elections.
Yep.
While Rome struggled with its own issues, the Church's authority also began to decline beyond the Alps. There, the Church was granted landholdings managed by local bishops and abbeys. Simony, the practice of purchasing ecclesiastical positions, gained popularity during this time. Feudal lords often appointed their younger sons, who could not inherit land, to ecclesiastical positions. Since clerics were not forbidden from marrying at that time, entire episcopal dynasties emerged in Europe. These families, with their wealth and power, could rival lords and counts. During this period, clergy often did not even pretend to focus on religious duties, but behaved like ordinary feudal knights, building castles and waging wars for land.
So you can see why, among other reasons, it was preferred for the sake of the church that clergy did not marry and have children.
Everyone in Europe understood that ecclesiastical positions had ceased to be purely spiritual roles.
And the thing is, too, that the church existed outside of the authority of the state. And this became a big problem, for example, in places like England, where you have a religious leader, a local cleric would commit a crime, but he wouldn't be tried for that crime by the state. He would have to be tried by an ecclesiastical court. The church controlled its own, even to things like murder and stealing and things like that.
They had become sources of power and wealth that attracted various feudal lords, and especially kings. From the 11th century onwards, the practice of investiture gained popularity in Europe, where kings began to appoint bishops and abbots in their kingdoms without the permission of the Pope or his cardinals.
Now the state is taking some of that power back little by little. And then you're going to get to people like Henry VIII, who's going to want to take a whole lot of that power back.
The Western Church was in crisis. It was during this period that the Reform movement began, led by the Cluniac Abbey. The abbey was known for its adherence to strict rules and for its abbots' avoidance of political involvement, unlike most other church representatives. The authority of the abbey grew significantly, and throughout the 10th century...
Could you imagine that people actually like the idea of the church getting back to being the church? And of course, that's going to threaten people who want the church to have more than just ecclesiastical authority.
Other monasteries began inviting Cluniac abbots to manage them in an effort to restore order. Over time, an unofficial order emerged, the Congregation of Cluny, which became, by the year 1000, the most authoritative ecclesiastical structure in feudal Europe.
And you see those keys, and that goes. That's the symbol of the Pope. You see that everywhere when you go to the Vatican. This is what's called the doctrine of the keys, and there's a scripture where Jesus is talking, and he says that he basically I give you all authority here on earth. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And there's a lot of question about exactly what that means, but there's no question in the Catholic Church what that means. That means that the Pope has authority over spiritual matters on earth.
On the other hand, the Cluniac monks were unable to reform the entire church, only individual monasteries. In Rome, the struggle for the papal throne continued unabated, culminating in 1014 when the German emperor gave the papal seat to the Tusculan counts, who had initiated the period of the pornocracy in the past. The Tusculan clan remained true to its traditions. For example, Pope John XIX, in an effort to keep the papal seat within his family, bribed the Roman nobility before his death to ensure that his 20-year-old nephew, Benedict IX, would be elected as the new pope. Benedict IX surpassed even his grandfather, John XII, in notoriety.
Congratulations.
He was accused of bribery, plundering monasteries, homosexuality, and even murder. The Romans expelled this pope from the city twice, but he returned each time with the emperor's troops and mercenaries, carrying out massacres in the city and maintaining his power through terror.
Think about that. I'm the head of the church. I am Christ's representative on earth. And if you don't listen to me, I'm going to call in the troops and we're going to kill you all. But here's the problem with all of this. This is a time in history when the average person in the church doesn't read or write. And so they don't have their Bibles to be able to say, hey, what you're doing is not scriptural. They don't know. They're only doing what they're told. The authority is very top down. And, the church Christianity is not seen by people as this personal relationship between you and God. It's only through the church, through the bishops, through the Pope, through your priest, that you have connection to God. And so it doesn't exist outside of that. And so they have all the cards. They have all the power.
1045, Benedict IX realized that he could not remain pope for long and decided to extract as much benefit as possible from his position. He sold the papal office to his godfather, Pope Gregory VI, and moved to his family's estates. Within a year, he squandered all his money and, seeking to regain the papal power, began a struggle against his godfather. Additionally, the Bishop of Sabina declared himself pope. Italy was on the brink of civil war. The German Emperor Henry III could not tolerate such chaos, so he crossed the Alps with his army and convened a synod. At this synod, all three claimants to the papacy were deposed. The new pope was the German Bishop Clement II.
Starting fresh.
Despite his brief reign, Clement II, a supporter of the Cluniac reform movement, managed to initiate important Cluniac reforms that transformed the entire Western Church. In the winter of 1049, a procession of pilgrims arrived in Rome. Among them was Bruno, the Bishop of Toul, accompanied by monks Humbert and Hildebrand. Bruno, who was the uncle of Emperor Henry III, was elected Pope Leo IX. He appointed his companions to high ecclesiastical positions and began actively advocating for reforms. Pope Leo IX was the first to attempt to outlaw simony and to limit the influence of secular authorities in church affairs. Due to Leo IX's reforms, a conflict arose with Byzantium. The Byzantines were accustomed to having Roman popes with limited power and authority. The reforms and strengthening of papal authority were met with hostility in Constantinople. Political disputes were once again masked as theological issues. Cardinal Humbert traveled to Constantinople to reconcile the two sides, but ended up clashing with the local clergy and declaring their excommunication. In response,
and excommunication was a big deal. This was the ultimate act that could be used by the church against an individual or a group of individuals. To be excommunicated was to be cut off from communion with the church. And it was basically a way of saying, you're going to hell. You are now outside of Christ. You are without Christ, and without Christ you cannot go to heaven. So I have declared your salvation forfeit, is basically what it means. It's pretty much the worst thing you could do to somebody.
Constantinople declared the Pope excommunicated as well. This confrontation led to the schism.
He's like, you're excommunicated. No, you!
Of the Christian Church into the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox branches. Pope Leo IX, though, did not witness the schism himself. He died shortly before it, having been captured by the Normans in southern Italy. Ironically, one of his successors, Pope Nicholas II, hired the Normans to seize Rome so that he could claim the papal throne. Pope Nicholas II enacted a significant reform in 1059. He established the Conclave, a special council composed exclusively of cardinals.
It's going to be something you're going to be hearing about a lot in the coming weeks.
Tasked with electing a new pope. This reform made the election of the pope an internal church matter, effectively excluding secular nobility and monarchs from the process.
So now you're making cardinals appointed by the pope the ones who choose the next pope. And right now the way it works in modern times, and it's changed a lot over time, is that any cardinal under the age of 80 is a part of the conclave. There's like 135 of them or something. And the vast majority of them, more than 100 of them, were appointed by the recently passed Pope Francis. So he's got a lot of influence on who his successor will be because he appointed like 80% of the people who are going to vote on the successor.
Subsequent reforms included the prohibition of marriages for priests, the banning of the sale of ecclesiastical positions, and the limitation of secular feudal interference in the appointment of clergy.
Good stuff.
The most renowned papal reformer was Hildebrand, known as Pope Gregory VII. He definitively prohibited simony and introduced penalties not only for priests who married, but also for those who facilitated such marriages or appointed already married individuals to ecclesiastical positions.
Yeah, and so you see the reform, you see how the church is correcting itself. And so a couple hundred years later, when you have Martin Luther come along, that's what he's hoping will happen. He's not setting out to start the Lutheran church, to start the Protestant Reformation. He's looking to see the church correct again some of the things that have crept into it, and unfortunately in that case it didn't happen.
Gregory VII also fought against the practice of investiture, where monarchs appointed bishops. All the same, no monarch was willing to relinquish the power to appoint bishops. Emperor Henry IV reacted most sharply to this. For several years, the Pope and the Emperor exchanged heated letters. But in 1075, a dispute arose between them over the appointment of the Bishop of Milan. The following year, Henry IV convened a synod of clergy in Germany, which declared Gregory VII deposed from the papal throne. Henry IV began gathering troops for a campaign into Italy, but in response, Gregory VII excommunicated the emperor. This action caused Henry IV to lose his army, allies, and support, as excommunication undermined the legitimacy of his rule.
Yeah, and it also gave other rulers the right to go after you because you were fair game now. You weren't protected by the church.
Consequently, instead of leading a military campaign, Henry IV traveled to Italy as a penitent, barefoot and dressed in rags. He sought forgiveness from the Pope, who was staying at the castle of Canossa, leading to the event known as the Walk to Canossa. The emperor had to wait outside the castle for 3 days before Gregory VII agreed to meet him and granted him absolution. Certainly, Emperor Henry IV could not forgive such an affront. For the first 3 years after the excommunication, he had to suppress uprisings among the German nobles, who no longer considered him their ruler. By 1080, Henry began preparing for war against the Pope once again. Gregory VII excommunicated the emperor a second time, but this had little effect. Henry had defeated all his enemies in Germany and had too strong a position. Within a year, the Pope was forced to flee Rome from Henry IV's soldiers, who installed their puppet pope in his place. Despite Gregory VII's downfall, his reforms were not to be undone.
Good.
By the end of the 11th century, the Catholic Church had significantly elevated its authority. Pope Urban II, building upon the reforms of his predecessors, emerged as a prominent political figure. In 1095, he convened the crucial Council of Clermont, where he not only excommunicated the French king for remarrying, but also issued a call for Christians
Seems
to
harsh.
liberate the Holy Land and the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem from
Deus
Muslim
Vult.
rule.
The Lord
By
wills
this
it.
time, the Pope's authority was so substantial that he was able to mobilize all of Europe for a religious campaign,
Crusade.
marking the beginning of the Crusades and a new chapter in Christian history.
All right, that was really good. I learned a lot, and I think he laid that out beautifully. I love his art style and just kind of how it's called History Mapped Out for a reason. So definitely check it out. The link's down in the description. Check his channel out. Subscribe if you like what you see. If you have other of his videos you'd like me to take a look at, The First Crusade might be a really good one to take a look at. Maybe I'll even record that before I leave this week. Thanks for watching.